What is the real value of your globalized consumption? Is a podcast series to trace back to the stages of production of the consumer products to discuss the factors involved and be influenced in the economic globalizations, or to try to raise up issues you had seldom or never thought of before purchase. I'm Alex Wong, the host of this episode. In this episode, we're going to focus on the fashion industry and some of the heavy industry happening in both developed and developing countries. In this podcast, I'm not trying to give you guys a lecture because I'm not qualified to educate anyone yet. I'm going to talk about some things that we all know, something that we see in our daily lives. Consider this as a sharing. I'm gonna talk about how the big corporations form the system that we all know, trace the process behind it, and discuss some of the problems that emerge from it. I would discuss the manufacturing industry happening in both developed countries and developing countries, and examine some of the problems arise from it. I think most of us will know that globalization is the standard for this world now. Indeed, this idea created the world we know now, and it seems that there's nothing wrong with it, because we always heard the benefits of globalizations. It creates jobs, facilitate the interactions between different peoples, and promote business chances. But everything has its downsides, and when something is happening on a global scale, there must be a global scale problem too. So what is the benefits of globalizations? It is the flow of people and personnel. No, I'm not talking about how globalization makes your guide easy to travel. I'm talking about people who travel to other places and the capital that circulate behind it. Until now, the transnational businesses made up almost 70% of the world trade. What I mean by that is some famous brand that we see every day, like Nike, Apple, or some intangible services like Google are the backbone of the world economy. Of course, finances and economy are much more complicated than that. And it doesn't mean that these brands are the world economy. And world economy is a very fake term anyway. But certainly, companies, some or some many companies have set foot in almost part of the world, which created a dominated situations for labor and capital. I want to talk about the bigger picture here. The globalizations of production or economy activity did not emerge out of nowhere. The governments in developing countries opened up their markets to attract foreign direct investment because they believe it would make them more accessible to capitals and investment. Government would loosen their regulations on like labor, the borders control or the environmental control to in order to attract more capital. It could be the investment from foreign companies, which is FDI or remittances from the migrant workers working abroad and sending home their money. This already implied that there was a flow of capital and workers because the regulations were loosened. It is always an impression to us that globalization created jobs. While this is true, that I must say this is a very problematic statement to make because it ignored many problems caused by the liberalization of trade. We enjoy cheap products now, or I should say affordable. It is certainly true that as we always hear our parents say that I don't have this when I was your age, or like this was very expensive to buy, but now you have it and I bought it for you. Things are now easier and cheaper to make. Most brands and companies that we are familiar with came from developed countries. It is a very common knowledge to us that the US, UK, or like developed countries in Europe or like Japan, they don't mass produce goods anymore, maybe except for Japan. Like, but brands need, we all know that a famous brand needs history and time to build. And when they were first started up, they were used to be made in those countries. But as the prices and labor costs went higher, the production plants are now being offshore to developing countries. I think the first wave was like China, South Korea, and Taiwan, etc. And as the prices of these places got higher, it is now Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, like this circulates around countries in Southeast Asia in general. Some of the brands that I can think of is Nike, Levi's, or Dr. Martens. They were used to be made in US or UK, but now they were made in foreign countries. I would like to talk about Nike more, since it was one of the most well-known brands in the world. Everyone knows Nike is from the US, and they were used to be made in the USA, or like even France. Like people now still find the vintage made in US, France, etc. Nike shoes or Nike clothing, and we can see that and they were willing to pay a very high price to it. So we can see that how consumers and fans value the spirit and items that were made in USA. And when Nike decided to like outsource their production, and when their production went global, they have factories in Vietnam, China, Thailand, India, you you name it, like and just anywhere cheap. But their shoes were still designed in the US, and they just outsourced them and subcontract their production to developing countries. Nike has been one of the most iconic sneaker brands ever, but as their production went global, scandals about their production plants have been following them. There has been a scandal called the Nike sweatshop, which is the famous event or a scandal, where the factories of Nike had offered very inhumane treatment to their workers. These workers were the victim of the liberalization and the lack of regulation on how the investment and the control on factories should be executed. These workers suffered from long working hours, child labor, unequal gender work of division in the factories, and the factories like put out pollutions that would contaminate their land and cause serious health problems to the people. These are some of the problems that are created when manufacturing business gone global. I think like fashion brands or like clothing brands were more serious, and some fast fashion brands like Nike or sportswear brand they will offshore and take advantages of the looser regulations of the developing countries. I'm not saying that all clothing companies are guilty here, and I think most of us wear affordable clothes. Like we can still buy affordable clothes because we cannot afford very expensive clothes, right? So like when we care about our style and buy new clothes every season, my suggestion is that we can find more like ethical brand when we can do some research before we bought new clothes, or wear more sustainable clothing, which is we can wear a clothes that is longer lasting or like wear it more times. But it is a very problematic things to say like which company is ethical. Like even though there are online reports on like which company is more ethical, as they don't abuse labor or don't like harm the environment, it is still really hard to assess like which company is more ethical just by pure numbers and words from these reports. There are still many questions need to be asked about the situations of the workers and environment. The profit that Nike earned would eventually flow back to the US. Now, there's nothing wrong with that because they are an American company and they need to pay their taxes to their government, to other governments, and the employees around the world. But the production process of them show the greediness of how bigger firms and large amounts of capital would flow back to one that had the history and power that designed the system. We rarely see brands from developing countries grow to a transnational scale because the market was already saturated and dominated by companies from more powerful countries. Even though more and more smaller brands are coming out from developing countries each year, the stereotype of developing countries is the world factory for the earth still exists, and it's indeed happening that a monopoly of the global economic system was happening among nations. Now this leads to another minor problem. It is minor, I don't know. A problem that I want to mention is that certain countries manufacture their products better. If I say made in Italy, you would probably imagine that it's a handmade good made by very old skilled artisans or tailor. But I can tell you that most of them are not, because there are also migrant workers who are willing to work in fish factories like Japan, Italy for a much lower price than the local workers. In a town called Prato in Italy, there are Chinese-owned factories making garments that were made by Chinese migrant workers. The Chinese owners who own the factories would put out production and efficiency much faster than the Italian-owned business. Therefore, they will successfully compete with local older business. So next time when you buy something that is made in Italy or Japan, it could probably be made by the same hand of some of the other clothes that were made in China. It was the price and the production of origin that blind the consumer in creating a stereotype of developed countries made better goods. Speaking of made in where, I want to talk about made in USA. I cannot talk about globalization without mentioning the US. The US has always been the big brother of the political hierarchy of the world order. With other Western powers, they have dominated the economic order since the end of the World War II. Recently, with the rise of new economic power like China, more and more FDI are made in US from China. In recent years, the US has a growing trade deficit with China, which rose to 375.6 billion US dollars in 2017. Companies like Fuyao, which manufacture glasses for vehicles in China, both closed down factories in the US and hired local workers. With lower pay and longer working hours than before, and the lack of labor rights, which is a work culture in China, were brought to the factory. And these are the things that were not used to the American workers. In the end, the company planned to cut down the numbers of workers and gradually shift to automatizations. This event will turn to a Netflix documentary, and I hope you can see it. You may not agree with everything, but it can serve as a basis to think about global trade. So, no matter it is made in a developed country or developing country, there's a certain cost we need to pay. Something that is made in Italy, China, Vietnam, or the USA, the exploitations of workers still happen. People from developed countries migrated to the to different part from developing countries migrate to different parts of the world to get manufacturing job and send money back to the families in the mother country. However, working in a developed country does not guarantee their pay and welfare. Rather, it was just a trick to satisfy the wants of the customer under capitalism. And the one that is truly getting benefits are the transnational companies that took advantage of globalizations and the workers. I must say that comparing the investment in developing and developed countries, developing countries still suffer most as their government had looser controls on the production and the flow of population and capital, and they were usually engaged in like the lower skilled production, which would cause more harm, longer working hours, and etc. But the nature of transnational firms investing in different countries is to make money for themselves. Creating jobs is not the main goal, and it really did not benefit people like the blue collar class in the manufacturing plants, as they were usually seen as disposable in the high capital circulation involved in transnational trade. The more capital involved in trade, the nature of humanity and human rights were ignored as the world turned into like a big casino for transnational corporations and big countries. So we may ask, where is the WTO? Like according to Wiki, like I want to get the most simple explanation for everyone, the definition for everyone. The WTO is an intergovernmental organization that regulates and facilitates international trade between nations. And while they're not regulating anything here, it seems that there are many problems happening. In fact, the criticism on the WTO has been continuous, for it constantly benefits developed countries over the poorer countries. The WTO is not intended to help the less privileged country, I can tell you, but it was to set a common standard on trade to its members. Something like tariffs and duties that are clearly protectionism imposed by developed countries like the US. can block the goods export from developing countries. And the WTO have a trade resolution bodies that can like resolve trade disputes, and it has a long history of siding with the more powerful countries, which left the developing countries with no voice and room to negotiate in terms of trade. So what the WTO do is it offer a same standard on trade to like both developed and developing countries. And while the developed countries has more resources and have more to sacrifice, the developing countries could not risk to break the rules and compete with the developed countries because they would always win with more resources and money. And they don't really have like an opinion and voice in this organization. So recently, during the Trump administration in the US, there are two events which I want to talk about. The first one is the trade war, and the second one is bringing back factories and jobs to the US. The first one is solving the US long problem, which is trade deficit with China, and the second one I think is to restore the pride of made in USA goods. And I believe these were the two reasons that got him to the office, like two of the main reasons. Okay, but I believe the trade war did not show how free the market could be. Rather than seeing market as a collective body, I think Trump used the hegemony and dominance of the US in international trade to increase tariffs and to protect its own country. And it and this action did not actually solve the trade deficit that US suffered on China with China. And also, bringing back jobs to the US was not successful either. Factories in Michigan are still closing down. It might be because of the pandemic, but bringing manufacturing back is easier said than be done. Because if you can't bring all the like, lower skill production back to the US in just a second. And as I kind of follow the like made in US fashion scene, I can see that more and more made in US production plants are really closing down. Like there are less US raw materials and like for example like denim and jeans making every year. So I can't confirm that based on this evidence, but I can tell you this is why I see the made in USA is like something that is slowly dying. Under a so-called free market, the market is free to the one who dare to speak louder and exercise its power while not respecting the rules. And I think that's the problem of global trade today. If people respect the rules and care about the most important element in the world, which I think is people, and like and be less selfish while doing international trade, the I can't say the problem will disappear, but the world will be a more equal place. So this is the end of my podcast. Remember, this is not a lecture because I don't think it's a very formal and informative one. Like maybe I try my best. Consider this as a little sharing, and I hope you all get something from this podcast. If you want to know more about the value and cost behind our daily consumption, make sure to stay tuned to the next episode by Kaylin and Angus. Bye bye.